There's no question that my life was impacted by two television shows, In Search of with Leonard Nimoy and Unsolved Mysteries hosted by Robert Stack. Both shows had an incredibly unsettling soundtrack and narrator voices that were authoritative and well enunciated at that. But Robert Stack's voice would haunt me. When I was 12 or so, I washed dishes on Friday nights at a bar about 7 blocks from my house. My parents' friends owned the bar, and I would walk back home around 10 as the kitchen closed up around that time. Most nights the walk would go as follows. I'd be walking home, and I would become convinced that one of the stars in the sky was moving, following me. I would pause and try to catch it in the act. Robert Stack's voice would come up into my head reciting one of those mysterious missing person stories where someone apparently just vanished up into the sky. Was it aliens? Only I would know, and I would be incapable of calling the hotline or local law enforcement. Most Friday nights I would sprint the last couple blocks home, where I would then sit up most of the night watching horror movies because this in no way fueled my irrational paranoia. But I would like to bring back one of those unsolved mystery features, an episode which I first saw as a kid in the late 1980s. The scene unfolds in Bradford, Pennsylvania. It's up in Pennsylvania's northern tier. The case remains unsolved. This is the story of the disappearance of Dale Kerstetter. Dale Kerstetter was an employee of Corning Glassworks in Bradford, Pennsylvania. Corning Glassworks have been around since the 1850s and is based up in New York State. They make a variety of products, notably Corningware, and these days, with the glass on many cell phones, they make the glass on many cell phones. The plant in Bradford still stands, but it's no longer a Corning facility. Dale had begun working with the company in 1959 or 1960 when he returned to his hometown following service in the Air Force. While at Corning, Dale had a relatively unremarkable career by all accounts, save for 2 incidents, one of which will be remembered because much debate surrounding his disappearance. Dale has 6 children, all of whom are adults at this point. Having divorced in the late 1970s, his 5 daughters lived out of the home, but his teenage son lived with him. Dale was last seen on September 12, 1997, when he took his shift as the night watchman just before 11 p.m. At the time his story was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, his disappearance was just over 2 years, and his children were interviewed for the story. They all described him as a friendly, caring guy who enjoyed his kids and the outdoors. Even his mother was interviewed. Earlier I had mentioned that Dale was an unremarkable employee by most accounts, save for a couple of incidents. The off-cited incident involves a misplaced forklift which was in danger of potentially exploding when its propane cylinder, many forklifts are propane-powered, was threatened by molten glass. At his own risk, Dale jumped into the forklift and drove it away, potentially saving others from harm. So Dale worked his Friday night, Saturday morning shift, only to be relieved by John Lindquist just before 8 that morning. But Dale wasn't around. His truck was in the parking lot, keys still inside, and there were other signs that he'd been there recently. Though John searched the building, he couldn't find Dale. Lindquist described Dale as a pretty regular and routine-oriented. So it was a bit out of place that he wasn't by the building entrance waiting to go home for the day as he typically was. In the cafeteria, Dale's lunch sat untouched and his work keys were there too. Later in the weekend, police from Cattaraugus County up in New York brought police dogs in order to search for Dale. At this time, nobody had referenced the security tapes, most everybody believing that Dale likely had a medical emergency of some sort and was probably incapacitated somewhere in the building unresponsive. The dogs followed Dale's scent to the factory kilns, which were monitored by multiple security cameras. Reviewing those security cameras gave further cause for alarm. Already, his scent being there was confusing because this was off his regular routine, his rounds as the night watchman. But when the video was reviewed, a masked man is seen on the screen. Later, he's seen speaking with Dale, walking with him. In another shot, as they're walking together, Dale makes direct eye contact with the camera. The motivation for this gesture is debated, as is another scene where the masked man is using a pallet jack to maneuver a large duffel-like bag, like a hockey bag. What was in the bag? Well, nearly $250,000 worth of platinum turned up missing from Corning's Bradford factory. Contemporary news articles state that a chainsaw was used to remove the platinum lining from the factory's furnace. The first conclusion was that the man was hauling the platinum out to a waiting vehicle. Platinum is some heavy stuff, like gold. It's dense, and I've read that a practical comparison would suggest that gold is about a third lighter than platinum. And while I know that platinum is expensive, I'm not totally sure just how much $250,000 is worth, or would weigh rather. All that would be pointless anyhow, because again, it's some heavy stuff, so why not ease your burden with a pallet jack, right? But the other potential object in the bag, in case you already haven't considered it, could have been Dale, or rather, Dale's body. Though Dale wasn't a heavy man, he wasn't even 5.5 feet tall. At no point does another masked man appear on the screen. So, to save yourself from lifting all that, you pallet jack, right? And this kind of segues into the debate around the look Dale gave to the security cameras. This is the second most debated facet of the story, perhaps. Was Dale trying to signal for help? Was he verifying that the camera was recording the intruder? Or was he taunting the company and or investigators? See, there are enough people out there who believe Dale was involved in the theft. This crowd typically cite Dale's disappearance as further evidence that he was an accomplice to the crime. I mean, he just lifted a tiny bit of precious metal from his employer, not quite, but close to $250,000 worth, in fact. What's more, most everyone concludes that someone had to be familiar with the factory to pull this off. Dale certainly was, and maybe the masked man was as well. But it's not required for him to be so if Dale is an inside man. Dale leads straight to the platinum, the load into the duffel, onto the jack, and they leave together in an as of yet unknown waiting vehicle outside. Maybe with a waiting driver, who knows? Personally, I don't buy this. I mean, it's certainly plausible, but with each passing year it becomes less so. Why? Because at the time of this recording, 29 years have passed. With Dale being as close to his family as it's claimed that he was, even to his mother who was alive at the time of the Unsolved Mysteries piece, you'd think that something would have come up. Some communication interrupted, some beans spilt. Again, when the Unsolved Mysteries episode brought the story to national attention, the incident had just passed the 2-year mark. Many of the Corning management interviewed for the segment seemed to believe that Dale was an accomplice in the robbery. And with that little bit of time that had transpired, it's not unreasonable to think that he may have been. But again, as we near that 30-year mark, it seems to be less and less convincing an argument. I'd like to point out some economics too for a minute, or speculate on economics for a minute. So for argument, let's round things so that Dale gets the biggest possible cut. That means we're going to say that he and only one other person made off with the rounded up figure of $250,000. Let's say they split it 50-50. Rather, let's say Dale was that inside man whose knowledge of the factory layout was imperative to the operation. Let's give him 60% of the cut. That would be $150,000. That's a lot of money, considering a Hershey bar only cost 2 pence back then. I'm just joking. A Hershey bar cost 40 cents in 1987. I remember, and I even verified it. because the cost of a candy bar at most gas stations these days is more than twice that. And yeah, that does make me feel like I should start comparison shopping for Cane's. I'm sorry. So in this scenario, let's go back to that, and not the candy bars. In this scenario, Dale has $150,000 worth of platinum. But that's the retail value of platinum in 1987 and not what it could be resold for. I imagine that $250,000 worth of a precious metal being taken into a dealer of these sorts of things would probably raise an eyebrow that few stories could assuage. Of course, those are reputable dealers, and these were followed up with by the Pennsylvania State Police. So they would have had to seek out disreputable dealers, you figure. Again, I don't know much about the precious metals trade, but I've worked in retail and I have a basic understanding of markup values. And I imagine that this would play a large factor in trading within an illicit underground market. Maybe as much as a 50 or 60%? I don't know, it's all speculative. It's been mentioned that Dale owed money, thus he had a motive. He owed somewhere less than $40,000, which included his house payment. To this I say, so what? It sounds like a wholly unremarkable figure. Further possible motives include his having been demoted not long before the robbery, which meant a loss in pay. This, tied in with the aforementioned debt, point back to money and dissatisfaction as principal motives for the crime. But again, in interviews, Dale's family state that he had stock and a supportive family and other options, and the family too were open to helping him out, and that the debt was not a significant issue in his life. And as far as that demotion that Dale was subjected to, what's often left out is that the Corning plant was downsizing at the time. In fact, within just a few years, the plant was sold to another corporation and has changed hands several times since. My guess was that Dale was just keeping his job as long as he could, and by 1987 he had less than a year before he could collect on his pension. In the Bradford region in the late 1980s, these types of jobs were fading out quick, and a lot of folks were either sizing down or moving out. Between 1980 and 1990, Bradford lost 15% of its population. The family also commented that Dale had left a full carton of cigarettes in his truck, and they feel that if he had gone on the lam, if he were a willing accomplice, he surely would have taken these with him. If he were alive today, Dale would be in his early 80s. It's difficult for me to imagine a man whose family seems to think so well of him that he would just break off all ties and risk so much for so little. Granted, I don't necessarily believe that the type of person to commit the Corning heist was the most rational of people, but Dale Kerstetter had no real criminal history that I could find. Sadly, I think it's most likely that Kerstetter was taken by the armed man either alive or in the duffel bag. His body dumped perhaps deep in the forests that surround Bradford or the Allegheny River above the Kinzu Dam, which is only a 20 minutes drive from the site. In fact, also in the county, there part of a human skull was found some years ago, but it was determined to be female. But who knows what the origin of that story is? And I don't say these things lightly or with any satisfaction either, as Dale's children are likely still around. Heck, he has grown adult grandchildren, and I'm confident that with each passing year, this sort of scenario plays out in their mind. In interviews, both televised and print, they declare their support of their father's innocence. They add, though, that even if he were involved, they're more concerned that he is alive and safe. By 1990, though, the family had hired a lawyer to have Dale declared legally deceased, but the state Supreme Court at the time denied the request. Representatives from Corning sided with the denial, themselves denying to pay Dale's pension or insurance to the family, tacitly reinforcing the belief that Dale was a co-conspirator in the theft. I should note, too, that also inside Dale's truck was a holster for a .22 pistol, and I can find no evidence that the gun ever turned up. Apparently he used it for shooting skunks, which sounds like spitting in the wind. If Dale had the gun on his person, why not take the holster? Did the masked man or a hitherto unknown accomplice grab it before Dale could? One of his daughters claims that he carried it with him whenever he did the weekend or overtime security shift, and that he occasionally picked these shifts up. In a case with so many confounding possibilities, I suppose it's too simple to conclude that Dale was either in on it and is living his life on the lam, or that he was an altogether innocent and likely murdered party. There is the possibility that Dale was both of these things, an accomplice and a victim. It reminds me of the most recent evidence in the Erie pizza bomber case. Could it have been that Dale was involved and then murdered following the heist? Maybe. Right now, though, with as little evidence as there is, it's all speculation.